So I am excited to be able to share this tonight. I am recording live, so just be patient with any glitches that come up. I will be sharing a presentation, so let me go ahead and pull that up. My background is in mental health. My name's Maribel Robles. I am a mother and wife. My logos. So the top logo is for my therapy business. I have a private practice in the city of Riverside, California. I am able to is what I use for all my social media. It's mainly to promote ancestral and cultural healing. That's part of where I come from, sharing about our ancestors, doing genealogy work. But my passion really stems from the mental health side because I know the importance of connecting to our roots, knowing more about our ancestors to give us a greater sense of identity and purpose. And that in the long term definitely helps us to have a better. So you might have not been able to see that bottom logo. Um, I don't know if I can move it. But the reason why we're here, we all have some type of connection to Mexico. We're curious about finding our ancestors. But just on a really quick note, Mexico is a very vibrant country in North America. Its capital is Mexico City, and it's one of the largest cities in the world. The official language we probably know is Spanish, unlike the United States that doesn't have an official language. And Mexico is known to have around 130 million people. So it is one of the most populated countries in the world. Before we start today, I wanted to share this poem. It's called Strangers in the Box by Pamela Harrison. Come look with me inside this drawer. In this box, I've often seen at the pictures black and white, faces proud, still, and serene. I wish I knew the people, these strangers in the box. Their names and all their memories are lost among my socks. I wonder what their lives were like. How did they spend their days? What about their special times? I'll never know their ways. If only someone had taken time to tell who, what, where, and when, these faces of my heritage would come to life again. Could this become the fate of the pictures we take today? The faces and the memories someday to be passed away. Take time to save your stories, seize opportunity when it knocks, or someday you and yours could be strangers in the box. So I think it was last year that I first heard this poem, and it definitely stood out because I have flipped through my family's photo books, not knowing many names to the family members that I see. And as I grew older, I became a lot more interested. So today we're sharing different ways that we can start finding out more about our ancestors because in my household, there was not a lot of talk about like the family stories. Some families do share a lot, but others don't. And if you're in a family that doesn't really share much, then it becomes like a bigger project to be able to gather information. So I will go over these different ways that you can start looking for more information. But of course, we have the interviews, we have family relics, we have books, we have Facebook groups, databases, DNA testing, and different archives that you can look into. And for interviews, you've probably heard one of those idioms that we have in Spanish, que preguntando se llega a Roma. So if we don't ask, no one is going to tell us anything. So if we start asking, we'd probably get very surprised how much information we're actually able to gather from our own family members. So if your grandparents are alive, I would definitely suggest to start by asking them questions. Obviously, your parents, but then your grandparents. And if you have any other older relatives, you can ask them. Try to gather information not only about them, but also about other relatives that they have that were older, maybe their grandparents, their great grandparents. Most of the time, from my experience, my relatives have been able to know the names of like the past two generations before them, but they weren't really sure 3 generations back. So when my parents couldn't tell me about the great great grandparents, that's when we started looking into the different databases. And I'll talk about that a little bit um, down the line. So we want to, when we're asking them these questions, we want to gather important dates. We want to pay attention to the names of the cities, towns, states, or countries that they're mentioning. Probably going to be within Mexico, but you never know. And then any physical descriptions of the people, like for example, my grandmother really likes to point out like how her great grandparents looked from what she remembers. So that can be important information to kind of trace a specific lineage if we're coming from indigenous background or more of a Spaniard background. You're maybe sometimes able to tell a little bit if they're giving like actual descriptions of what they look like. And then another thing that's really important is to track like the relationships to each other. So sometimes they don't remember, they don't know all of the names of all of the siblings of their grandmother or great grandmother, but they might have a couple, and then you can try to ask like who were they related to. And when it comes to the family relics or las reliquias, these are important items that have been in the family, or maybe it just belonged to a specific person. So, for example, maybe your grandmother was very religious and she had like rosaries or a crucifix or her Bible or a prayer book, and that becomes something that's cherished because it has like an emotional value to someone. That can sometimes provide some information about what that person was like, what was found amongst their belongings, what were the things that the family kept. But others, of course, are like photographs. You might find letters, diaries, jewelry, any other book. Maybe you had some ancestor that was actually very curious about nature or astronomy, and they tend to have those type of books at home, and someone kept them. Like, what a treasure that is. Cooking tools, por eso está el molcajete. So we have um, sometimes have heard of family members that have had a molcajete or a metate for like up to 3 generations. I'm sure they can last a long time, but I've seen others that even in the span of 30 years, they get really worn down. So you never know like what tools could be found. Traditions here, it got cut off, but it can be customs or beliefs. I'm gonna tie that back into also with the cooking. Sometimes it's a specific way of doing a meal, una receta familiar. You can also see that as a relic. So I think now we can find more books that help us like keep track of our family's recipes, but for the most part, it's oral traditions. But it's definitely important if we don't want to be strangers in a box or like not give credit where credit is due to know like quién fue la persona que hizo la receta. Who was the person that started making that type of bread or the tamales that way or the pozole a certain way. So all families have their secret ingredients. And then we also want to get a little more books, like have a little bit more knowledge, knowing the history of what is known as La Conquista, knowing about like the explorers, when they arrived, where they arrived. That's all valuable information. You can find books about that. I specifically have been focusing on the state of Michoacan. So I suggest like if you're interested in a certain area, then be curious about that and read books that focus on that area. I'm gonna tag below a book that has been like really helpful for me as far as like explaining history for Michoacan. It's called The Complete History of Michoacan. I got it on Amazon, and you can use my link to get the book. Also know that geography was very different. Like sometimes we have a hard time putting ourselves outside of like what we know or how we like know things now. Things were different back then. So knowing there's some apps that have like old maps, those are really interesting. And then there's also the history about how the land was shifting. Like once it was invaded, we know to be areas where the missions were placed. Then there's like the presidios, and there was the ranches, and then there was the land grants. So you want to like know what did it look like in the past. It's probably not gonna be the same name of the town that you visit or that your parents talk about. And then just also know like there was so much corruption back then. So it's sometimes hard to read a lot of this information. Mentioning the missions, like that's what I learned. The three main groups that were settling in Mexico and other areas were the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Jesuits. You can find a lot of information on missions. That's actually not an area that I focused on when it comes to Mexico. I know more about the missions from like the California coast, and I'll talk a little bit again about missions when we talk about archives. And then also knowing, like I was talking about how the land has been split, it wasn't always states, like how we know these states now. So we have that reference for when we had some Mexican states. It mentioned 19. I don't know if it was only 19 back in 1824, but it's changed, right? It was at some point just called New Spain, and then things started shifting over the centuries. The Facebook groups have been really, really helpful to me. So the first two are the ones that I used the most when I first started my genealogy work back in 2020. So Moises Garza has a website as well, but he has coordinated the Mexican genealogy group, and then there's other groups from the same branch but by state. So for example, I study Michoacan and Oaxaca, so I am also part of those two groups. Moises Garza also puts an annual conference for Mexican genealogy called We Are Cousins. I think it just happened this past weekend. For this year. This year I didn't participate, but look forward to participating next year. And then the next group, New Spain and Mexico History slash Genealogy slash Cultura, is moderated by Cindy Medina, who has like an extensive background in genealogy and history work for Mexico and Mexican American culture. So that's definitely also a good group where you get like lots of helpful information. I will say that's more of a group where we get to share about the culture. Sometimes people share about the genealogy, but Mexican genealogy, definitely those groups, people post like actual clips of the documents they're finding, and then you can ask for help if you're having a hard time reading something. Like people are super helpful. And then we have the other group that's more recent to me, Iris Neri, Alicia Flores. I listened to her in a podcast for another therapist who was doing some of her genealogy work. And her Facebook group is called Discovering Your Mexican Genealogy. She does lots of presentations, but I believe she's out in Massachusetts. So they're not like presentations that I can attend, but she also does like Facebook Lives where she answers questions. So she's definitely a good resource. The other Facebook group that I use sometimes is called Descubre tu Genealogy, and that's also where people can get some support. So at the bottom, I have Juan Zapata, and I follow him on TikTok at Arid American. He does genealogy work professionally. I've also hired him to do some work for me, help me to continue tracing my lineages because it is time consuming work. And sometimes, like, you're just too curious and want to get ahead. So, I did hire him to help me out for some hours and then look forward to doing that again in the near future. But if you follow him on TikTok, he also shares good resources on his videos. I wanted to say, Iris Neri and Juan, I do know that you can contact and hire for support. Sorry, dry throat. And then as far as databases, if people are interested, I'll make another video sharing more about what would it actually look like to go on Family Search. I That's the main database that I'm using. It is free to access. You don't have to pay anything, and you're able to build your family tree directly on there and link all the documents that you're finding. Ancestry does the same thing, but it's more protected, and they also have a fee. So you can pay monthly or I believe annually. And aside from that, you can also go into the census records. Some, I can't tell you which exactly, but some census records are able to be looked up under Family Search. So that's also good to know. And when we're talking about what am I going to find when I go to these databases, there's other things. These are the main things that I have looked at. So the birth certificates for my ancestors, the baptismal or marriage certificate, and the debt records. The census records, like I said, some are there, some are not. Um, for the birth certificates, it's probably one of the most important documents, but the one that provides a lot of helpful information is if they were married through the Catholic Church, then there's records about their marriage, and that tends to have the names, the towns of their parents, so then you're able to get a little bit more information. And this is just as a precaution. A lot of people that do this work say that it's important to duplicate it. So have backup files, have a way to like export your information so that if for some reason you end up losing access to your database work, then you still have either external hard drive with your information, or you've somehow uploaded it to a cloud or something, because we know with technology sometimes things like that happen. And so I mentioned this before. Family search allows anyone to modify your tree. So that is one reason that like professional genealogists probably don't use it, but us amateur people, we love free things. At least I do. Ancestry has a paid plan, and from what I saw, it was too pricey for me. So when you're doing these searches using these databases, it's important to stay organized just along the duplicating your work. Have some type of system of how you're going to be tracking or keeping records. And then there's the popular like DNA testing option. In full transparency, this is where I started. I'm only putting 3 of the companies that you can use for DNA testing. I utilized 23andMe back in 2020 to give me some information. It didn't give me any specific relative names, but doing that DNA testing definitely sparked my interest of wanting to know more. So my results came back, and I was like, oh, I know nothing about my indigenous roots. So I am going to start finding out. And shortly after that, my maternal grandmother passed away, and I had the sense that she wanted me to know more. So even though I miss her and feel sad, I also feel her like completely connected to me, guiding me and finding more information. So it's like a loss, and at the same time, it was like an awakening. And here are some archives that can be used. So if you are interested or have found that some of your relatives lived in a mission, Santa Barbara Mission Archives, I haven't gone there directly to search for information. So I don't know if they have things about missions in Mexico, but it is one of the biggest archives to find information about missions. And then there's the General Land Office Archives, there's the National Archives of the United States, the National Archives of Mexico, um, the Hemeroteca Nacional Digital de Mexico. The hemeroteca is just like a fancy word for newspaper archives. So you can find access to the different newspapers. I'm sure not everything is digitalized, but you are definitely able to find things that you would not have even dreamt of finding. So if you like digging more into newspapers and the history, that's also an option. I share here some of the pictures that I was able to collect once I started asking my family members. I have my dad's father at the top. He was killed back in 1976 when my father was only 15 years old, and there is actually very little pictures of him, maybe 2 or 3. And this was one that we were able to find from when he was in his early 20s. And then the bottom one is the picture of my paternal grandmother's father, who I did not meet, but I am very happy to be able to have his picture. And then the back is my grandmother's family. So also another like family treasure that now I'm able to share with my daughters because I've started doing this work. So I'm looking forward to hearing stories from other people who are also doing their genealogy work, trying to find their ancestors. One of the biggest reasons I decided to do this today is because Dia de los Muertos is coming up, and every year since I've been doing my genealogy search, I'm able to add new information. So that is my hope for other people who are interested to have more knowledge of who our ancestors were. If you're interested about this type of topic, that let's definitely stay connected. You can follow me on social media at Hijas Bellas. That's the same for IG, TikTok, Pinterest, Facebook. And if you're watching this video and haven't subscribed, please do so and make sure to give it a thumbs up.